Good evening, Best Choice Realty. So I've got Shannon Hall here with me, and we're going to be going over the 41C. It is a new addendum. They did revise it, and we want to go over some of the background on when you would use it, how you would use it, and how you would fill it out. We get a lot of questions about this form. So to get started, just a little background about 41C. We use the 41C in our firm fairly regularly when we were working and representing off-market properties. But as things have progressed at the Northwest MLS, there's been a need to go ahead and provide more transparency when it comes to compensation. So not only the off market, but allowing sellers and buyers to negotiate compensation on how they're paying their broker. So 41C attempts to do that, and it does it very well. It does become confusing as to which box do I check if this is something new to you. So the situation we have here is we've got 1% that is on the listing. There is a listing agreement that's in place, but our brokerage, we have received a buyer agency agreement that's signed, and it is actually more than 1%. And so we are going to attempt to negotiate with the seller when we write this offer for the additional compensation, just like our buyer agency agreement alludes to. So let's go ahead and click on 41C. There we go. And Shannon, so this would be the example. First box, it says that there is no offered compensation. On that situation, we wouldn't use that box number 1. We would check box number 2 in that scenario, where there was a listing agreement and they were agreeing to pay 1%. But we are going to check box number 2, not box number 1. We're going to check box number 2, and we're going to fill in the additional amount. So go ahead and check that box, Shannon. Nope, we're going to go with the second box because there is a listing agreement and they are agreeing to pay 1%. But we're going to go ahead and fill in the difference. So we are asking for the additional 2% to make the total 3% that matches our buyer agency agreement. That would be filled out correctly, okay? This also gets added to the purchase and sale agreement with all of the extra addendum, and it does require initials on the bottom of this form, okay? So that would be that scenario. There are times, Shannon, where we would use the first box. Can we rework this and just go back and when would we use the first box as an option?
Yeah. So there's 2 scenarios where you would use this section up here, buyer brokerage firm's compensation. So the first one, it says there's no offer of compensation from seller to buyer brokerage firm in the listing. So that would be in the scenario if a seller in the listing decided that they are not going to pay a buyer agency at all. They don't want to pay a buyer agent commission or compensation is what it is now. So in that scenario, we would check the box, and then if you're asking for the seller to indeed pay you a compensation amount, that's where you could indicate it. And the second scenario where you would use this section up here would be if it is an off-market transaction. If the seller was representing themselves, or maybe it was a neighbor that is selling to a family member or something like that, where it's off market, it's not on the market, they don't have an agent, and your buyer is asking you to represent them. So in that scenario, we would check that seller has not signed a listing agreement because it's not on the market, they don't have an agent, they didn't agree to or pre-agree to any sort of compensation for you as a buyer's agent. And this is where you could ask for them to pay for your compensation.
Well,
so that could be
just say, Shannon, that they don't want to pay. The buyer's actually fine just paying your compensation because there's a buyer agency agreement in place. Go ahead and fill in, let's just in that scenario say that 0. Then seller understands that 0. And then what we would do, just to make it clear for everybody, there's a section that says other. And then if you guys can go ahead and type in, just to make it very clear to all the parties, buyer is paying for buyer agent, buyer broker, compensation.
Buyer brokerage.
There you go. Per the buyer agency agreement. Okay. And then you could put the amount too. Buyer is paying for buyer brokerage agreement, and you could just put 3%. You don't have to. because the compensation agreement, we do have a Form 40 or 40A that gets submitted to escrow. Speaking of that, Shannon, which do I use? If I'm having to basically, the buyer is paying for their own, my compensation, would they use the 40 or would they use the 40A?
So if the seller is paying for 100% of the buyer's commission, the buyer's compensation, I know, we're still kind of figuring this out, huh? If they're paying for 100% of the compensation, it's business as usual, what we've been doing in the past, which is the Form 40.
Okay.
If the buyer is having to come up with any of that compensation, say the listing offered 2% and you are asking for a 3% compensation, there's a difference of about 1%. So how is that 1% handled? If the buyer is paying and covering that 1%, that's when you would have a buyer agency agreement and you would have an accompanying 40A instead or in addition to the Form 40 that you already are used to preparing. They look pretty similar. So this is the Form 40. This is what we use if the seller is paying for the compensation. So in that scenario, if the buyer is paying for some of the commission, this is the 40A, they would put this, I know, it's like a penny in a jar. So they would put, the buyer would pay for the amount you would list here. And then this is where you would put the disbursement instructions for escrow.
Okay. And it does look like they added a buyer signature as well as a broker signature as well. So if there is some places that require that, they're done purposely so that the lender can actually have proof that they have the funds and that there has been some disclosure. That's where you'll want to work with your lender and make sure you get either the Form 40A specifically, get that over to escrow as soon as possible, because they have certain timelines where they have to balance out with the lender and we have to make sure it's allowable to go this route. Okay, so let's make sure we get the 40A and know when to use the difference between the 40A and the Form 40. But the 40 and the 40A are not part of the contract. They are used to communicate with escrow and with lenders. That's what the Form 40s and the 40A is used to do. Now we go back to the Form 41C, Shannon, let's go through the next scenario, which is the number 2. I think we want to kind of go over that a little bit more on the additional buyer brokerage firm compensation. Just to be clear, if you can uncheck the box, we're going to scrap the first one. It does not require the buyer agency agreement. You do not have to provide that. When you're negotiating this way, where maybe the seller has agreed to pay, in this case, the 1%, we're asking for the 2% for a total of 3%. The seller could still say no. They could counter you. In fact, that's very common when we do off market, where they'll come back and they'll cross things off and they'll just make sure, just like in the past, when you cross things off, initials are required and there may need to be some adjustments. And that's why they have that section. If you go down a little bit, Shannon, they have that section where it's other or there's credits that are applied. You may have to counter and understand these other sections of the 41C to make the numbers make sense, that it actually totals correctly on how the buyer and seller are negotiating your compensation. So be prepared for that. That was a real situation that just happened yesterday where we had an offer that came in and, it was only a 1% agreement to pay the buyer. We negotiated, or we attempted to negotiate, but then it had to come down. We had to kind of come to an agreement. And what it ended up being was it was actually 2%. They were willing to pay 1.5% for a total of 2.5%, but there still was a difference in that 2.5% to 3%, which we had already predetermined with the buyer agency agreement that we had signed with our firm. So in that case, we checked the box here. We adjusted, Shannon, if you could. So the buyer brokerage firm's total compensation paid by the seller was 2.5. So just, back it off. And then that was 2.5. And then what we ended up doing is checking the other box right down below, keep going down. And we just said buyers paying for additional just so everybody was clear on how everything totaled out of the 0.5%. Okay. And then that would be instructions for escrow when they get the contract and then they get the 40A, they'll understand that the buyer is coming up with the additional 0.5%. And then when they see the 40, so in that case, you're going to probably need a 40 and a 40A so the escrow is clear on how much funds are being paid for by the seller and how much funds the buyer is coming up with on their own. Okay, let's uncheck that, scrap that one, Shannon. Let's go to the third box, the credit to buyer. Now this one, we actually at Best Choice Realty do not use this one very regularly because we advise that our brokers use a buyer agency agreement. Ever since we had the change in 2019, where we had our buyer agency agreement vetted by our in-house attorney and law firm, we went ahead and promoted that. And so many of our new brokers that have been licensed less than 2 years, 3 years, they are using our buyer agency agreement in-house and using it very fluidly, I would say. So in our buyer agency agreement, it already handles the situation very nicely. So it says that the buyer is okay with us getting paid any additional funds. But sometimes in this situation where you would have like a family member, maybe you don't have a buyer agency agreement in place, where you have to be a bit more transparent about any kind of credits that are offered, this is when you would use this box. We have some agents that negotiate with their family members. Maybe they're only getting paid compensation of 1%, but then they're basically crediting the buyer 2.5%. Or 2% of that. That would be an instance where this would come into play. So the buyer brokerage compensation shall be reduced from the amount offered. So maybe it was reduced, it was advertised as a 3%, but we were going to credit our buyer. Let's say we're going to give them a good chunk of our compensation, which can be negotiated. Compensation is negotiable. So I gave them 2% to help them with their closing costs. So Best Choice Realty is only making 1% in that instance, which again is not really normal for us to do, but we have done that in the past. And that's where the buyer brokerage firm total compensation paid by the seller is 1%. So it's very clear to that particular seller and buyer because it's in the contract on how that's being done. Again, you wouldn't have the other, but that's how you would use that section. The last one right here, reduction in buyer brokerage compensation. This one, Shannon, have we ever seen this one being used?
In the last 2 years, before this form was in effect, this was used as a negotiation tool during a multiple offer scenario. So in that situation where a seller is purely looking at their net, on what they're going to net proceeds going to be. This was something that some agents would use as a tool to be competitive when their buyers maybe were at their capacity on what they could do. So in that scenario, if they were wanting and able to reduce the compensation, say from 3% to 2%, thus increasing the net to seller, this is where they could do that. So buyer's brokerage firm compensation shall be reduced from the amount offered. Say it was 3%, by say 1%. We're basically giving a 1% credit to the seller. The purchase price offered by buyer reflects this reduction in compensation due to the buyer brokerage firm. Okay. So buyer brokerage firm total compensation paid by seller shall be 2%.
Okay. So that's a total of 3%, but we're giving basically, it's just a way that we're reducing our compensation on our side of things, correct?
Yeah, we're giving a benefit to the seller. So in that scenario, we're basically saying, instead of taking a 3%, thank you so much, seller, but I'm trying to make this offer as appealing to you as possible. So in that scenario, I'm willing to reduce and give up part of my commission to make this deal happen, especially if there was another offer on the table that maybe was identical. A difference of 1%, 0.5% could be the make or break moment. And if the buyer couldn't make any adjustments, some agents do make that type of concession.
Okay. No, that's great. I think that's super. Then they put an other box. So that is a new term that they went ahead and threw into this 41C, which I like. I'm glad that they have that place. I think we saw a lot of creativity in the past few years. So I'm glad that they accommodated that part. The other section, I don't want you to get too creative. It requires it requires the buyer brokerage firm. So again, if you are like contemplating doing something creative or writing something into the section, please just reach out to me. It might just save you a ton of, even just if you write it wrong, if you end up writing something that's misleading or confusing, I don't want you guys using a Form 34 to negotiate any kind of compensation, especially when it has to do with the firm and what we're taking in. We are responsible for making sure we pay the appropriate taxes and making sure that the amounts are correct. We do a great job in our office of making sure things are done correctly. So don't make it hard on us by using a Form 34 and trying to write something. Let's keep it here, but involve me. Give me a call or text me if you have any questions at all about what you would put in this particular section. It's very rare you'll need to use it, but there are some circumstances that it is needed. So in this one that we have from before, we have that you have to buyers paying the additional per the buyer agency agreement. I've also seen people get kind of creative where it's like, oh, I want to put something in about a home warranty, about some sort of credit that we are going to be paying for. That would be a good place to put it if you didn't put it on the 22D. This might be a better place actually, because that's handled on the Form 40 or as far as compensation or credits for home warranty. So I can see this actually being a better place maybe, perhaps when it comes to who's paying for the home warranty. That might be a place that you might want to consider putting it. The last part of the form talks about the tail clause. And we've talked about tail clauses before in other trainings. The default is 180 days. If you guys could just leave the 180 days, I think that's sufficient to cover you for most instances. But that also is a negotiable item. All right.
Well, and I think I'll pipe in too. I think a lot of people are concerned about this new form and the complexity that sometimes it can offer. But I think for a lot of people, at least with agents with Best Choice Realty, because of the way that our compensation plan is structured for our real estate brokers, it does allow you guys a lot more clarity and opportunities to really offer and be transparent on what you're doing with your consumers. So because of the way that we're structured, you actually have that ability to offer these types of incentives to seller and buyer. So I would look at it as just another way to be more clear about how we're getting paid, which is not a bad thing, right? I think most people understand that when you're using a service, there is some sort of service rendered fee. So
that's right. Well, and then we've talked about throughout our videos, really kind of buttoning this up, clarity, compensation, all of the C things, right? And then just being competitive. I like that you've ended with that. Shameless plug, Shannon, as far as a competitive edge that we have when we understand the forms. I think that is a huge advantage when working with somebody at Best Choice. So thank you so much for taking the time with me, Shannon. It was great to hear your feedback on some of the reasons or things that you've seen, at least in the little bit that we've been working through this form. So have a great day, you guys.